Katharine Willis from the University of Plymouth in the UK, and this lecture is titled Sense and the City. In this talk, we're going to think about ways we understand the city, and also the felt or the lived experience, or the quality of life in urban spaces. We're going to cover the ways that our emotional responses to the city can become quantifiable, and then how this could be used to think about how cities are designed and planned in the future. Many of us live in cities, and if you think of a city, you may think of buildings or landmarks or the neighbourhood where we live. But when we consider what cities mean to us, we will often think about the places where we live or where we work, not just what their function is or what they look like, but how they make us feel. So we might think about how they make us feel happy or lost or relaxed. Or maybe it's fear and it's a place that we avoid. Now think about a place in the city where you live and how it makes you feel. And we're going to think about that place, whether it makes us feel positive or maybe it makes us feel stressed as well. So our sense of the city, our emotional response to everyday places, is actually what the city is to many people. But this is often not made very tangible, and typically a city is recognised and valued for its physical attributes, so the streets, the buildings, the houses. But cities have always been understood as eliciting emotional responses, and that's been part of the idea that the sense of the city is something that we can understand. But the senses of the city are not often translated into how we plan and manage cities. They're difficult to understand and measure, particularly at scale, and they don't translate well into information and data. For example, the field of urban planning has avoided allowing emotions to influence analysis and recommendations, and this is largely due to the fact that objectivity encourages planners to frame their beliefs about the future using concepts that really exclude emotions and feelings almost entirely. But we can see a shift, and this has resulted in a turn towards new models of participation that translate our emotional responses or experience of the city into something that can be tangible and actioned. And we need to be able to give people the ability to participate. Henri Lefebvre talks about the idea of the right to the city, which he argues gives the right to participation. And Saskia Sassen frames this as giving the city speech. This is particularly true in urban planning and the design of cities. But to participate meaningfully, we need to be able to give agency to citizens, and this means recognising their right to a fair and just quality of life, their right to the city. Sherry Arnstein first introduced the idea of how we translate everyday views in urban planning into power through her ladder of participation. And she says there's a critical difference between going through the empty or tokenistic model of participation and having the real power needed to affect outcomes and make change to processes and cities. What I'm going to propose here is that we think about the city not just as the physical form of the city, but as an emotional layer. This is the sense. That creates a relationship between people's everyday emotional responses and the physical features and characteristics of the city. This can help create a right to the city by bridging the gap between the citizen and their experience and everyday quality of life, and urban planning and design processes that need more formal data and measurements and more formal understanding of the city. So in terms of emotions, one of the most powerful emotions we experience is stress. And in fact, it's one of the key ways in which we experience the city. The city can be a stressful place, which causes reactions in people. And these are called environmental stressors. But these stress responses are compounded for people who are already marginalised, such as those who have different experiences of mobility with disabilities, for women or those living in poverty. For example, a person living in an informal settlement will typically experience higher levels of emotional stress due to their environment. For example, Mumbai is often quoted as one of the cities in the world with the highest stress levels. Now imagine navigating to Ravi, an informal settlement in Mumbai, in a wheelchair, or of a woman with a small child. And they haven't had ways to express or quantify these stresses they experience every day, and that hasn't been able to give them action in how they give their right to the city. So capturing objective and quantifiable data can be a way to address this. For example, the stress impact of encountering steps in a path for a wheelchair user. One of the key ways to do this is using new ways to create participatory data through empowering people to play an active role in how they create that data and how it's used. This means using new digital sensors to collect data in ways that captures information about the physical environment, but also sensors that capture what's called biometric data, which is the data or the sensors that measure human emotions or our senses. In this way, we can get an interplay between data which is quantifiable about our emotions and our experience, and which is what we describe as our sense of the city. And it can also equate to how we experience stress, so our sense and our stress experience. For example, the excellent work on data feminism, which provides a gender lens on data. And this expressly prioritises emotion and embodiment as the ways to achieve data justice for women, who are often one of the most excluded groups in our cities. How we participate and providing data contributing to the meaning of the city can help be part of that structure. If we want to give agency to people and give them access, we need to give them ability to work with digital data, and this can be a new way to do it. There have been some excellent crowdsourcing social media projects and app-based solutions, such as SafetyPin, which are effective around women's safety through a data-based approach. But as I said, this can be achieved through the use of sensors to enable people to share their emotional experience of the city in a way that helps inform design and planning and increases quality of life. Now we're going to look at a case study of how this can be achieved and how it might work in an actual city. I'm going to introduce an approach called the emotional data audit, or the EDA, that combines emotional data in the form of biometric data gathered from people moving through the city or in particular places, and using that through lightweight sensors. And then these are linked to their physical location, so we can get a link between the emotion and the place. But biometric data is a new way to create this approach through the emotional data audit, and gathers data using a method called galvanic skin response, or GSR, which is basically a measure of our stress levels from our skin. And it is combined with GPS, which is a measure of location, to link emotional responses as people move around the city, and link that to the place. And this can be quantified as an emotional response and give this objective measure of emotions that there's more than just qualitative feelings that can inform the urban planning approach. The emotional data audit involves co-design as a centre to its approach. The first stage is that people or a community identify an area of the city or a challenge that they want to take action on. Then we arrange for them to undertake walks or move through the city using emotional data gathering, the emotional data audit. We then visualise this emotional data audit from the individuals on a map of the city to indicate points, specific points with high or low stress peaks, and we combine this into a joint map. The map of the stress and the positive or negative emotions and the data are used as a discussion point with city planners to both identify the areas of stress and identify the opportunities for change. For example, we've done some work with city councils here in the UK, and we've used emotional data audits as a method, but in particular parts of the city, and used this to communicate with urban planning staff and representatives of the city. And it's helped them understand the problems or the challenges, and also put in place changes to make the streets more accessible, but also to help reduce stress levels in the people who experience those places. In London, we worked with teenagers in schools in the London Borough to create an emotional data audit of the neighbourhood of Hackney in East London. And the audit revealed that green space, such as parks, were actually highly stressful due to things like crime levels. And teenage girls in particular felt excluded from those spaces. This is counter to the research that shows that green space, such as parks, can be relaxing and reduce stress. And the data enabled them to think about the fact that well-being was also an important aspect of how they managed their parks and how that could be actioned. So this small example shows that what we can do with this emotional data and how we can use this in an actionable sense. We argue that if you use emotional data in this way, it can be a method of creating empathy and understanding for public participants or residents and planners alike that can cut through institutional boundaries and bridge this gap between logic and emotion. Emotion in this way becomes a method for collaboration, since it enables people to articulate their feelings in quantifiable ways in particular places. With the result, the emotion itself becomes part of how we can achieve livable cities. But in order to take individual data and combine it with other people's data to make it actionable, we've developed a broader framework called the emotional data framework and how this can be actioned in the city. We'd argue that city planners need to work together with citizens to undertake these emotional data audits, particularly around areas of contention or development, places that need to be actioned, and maybe areas that have been overlooked or underrepresented. This is particularly true for the global majority, where we often have unplanned spaces, and we have cities or neighbourhoods where people often don't have access to data, typical data, or rights to participation. But they actually have a really good lived experience of that place, and they know it well. So in order to achieve citizen power, we need to think about Einstein's idea of citizen power in terms of the ladder, and we suggested that there's a mixture of methods that we need to do this to achieve participation. This is both people gathering their emotional response to that city, but then linking it to those data collection methods such as the emotional data audit. In this way, the participant or the resident has an active role and is actually the initiator or the collaborator in that process. So the emotional data framework says that they start and that people can define the problem. So they may come in saying they're concerned about some particular aspects of the city, or there's maybe some high quality in a space that's been overlooked or not represented, and they want to be able to communicate that and give it value to ensure the space is protected. So how might we actually do this in terms of how we plan a city? So if you're either the mayor of a city or just a local community advocacy group, what might you do in a practical sense? So the emotional data framework outlines these 3 stages. The first stage is to gather data using the emotional data audit method. This is to identify the challenge and also to understand from the city or the particular organisation how that fits in the context of what they want to develop or understand about a space. And that really is about that first stage of listening to the needs of local people, particularly those of marginalised groups, to gather that data, and the emotional data audit is the start of the project. Practically, this means the group would undertake the audit, and then this would be transformed into the data map. This produces data that can identify those challenges for the specific marginalised groups, and also the areas of the city with high or low environmental stressors. The second stage is to create ways to share that data through the emotional data framework methodology. This involves creating processes to share that emotional data audit in ways that are linked with the urban planning and the public health, sector, with those professionals that map to quality of life indicators. We can share this emotional data with local and national governments to guide and prioritise their actions and to link it back to things that they need to take action in the city. And the third stage is to inform. You might want to upskill or train communities to undertake emotional data audits for themselves and create emotional data maps that are accessible in cities and again integrated with quality of life measures. So this can inform the future design and the policy making in the city, which corresponds to the needs and desires of those local communities. This third stage loops back to the first in an ongoing process and undertakes over time. So the emotional data framework and this 3-stage approach aims to recognise those seldom heard voices, for example, people with mobility issues, the children or asylum seekers, and how they feel about the city. If we can explain their experiences in the form of data and share them with the city in that 3-stage approach, then their senses become actionable. And this can help to start changes and give them better rights to the city. I hope I've established here that emotion matters. How we feel about a place is not just our own sort of internalised or private experience. It's part of how we make sense of a place, a sense of the city, and part of what quality of life means to us. And that communicating and giving value can transform that into an actionable process. To give citizens agency can really transform the idea of the sense of the city. If you want to undertake this work in your own city, there's a resources and a publication list in the summary of this talk. So perhaps you can undertake this in the city where you live.